Taxpayers already said no to a bigger jail. We want to invest in people's success, not in their failure. We've found that a bigger jail is self-destructive because it escalates expenses, trauma, and loss to the community. In this presentation, we're going to talk about first how jails create trauma, bad habits, and destructive results for people. Secondly, that there are hidden punishments and penalties that compound inside the community that are self-destructive. And three, that bigger jails extract money to national businesses, hurting the local economy. And lastly, that there are restorative solutions that heal people and strengthen community when we look for them. There will be references on the last slide that talk about statistics and details, but we want to stay with the philosophy and an understanding of how the destructive cycle of depreciating our community starts at an arrest. There is a domino effect of trauma that compounds the instant someone gets arrested, whether or not they're guilty. With an arrest, what can happen is immediate trauma, shaming, and shunning. They're taken out of the income world, so they enter a debt cycle rather than an income producing cycle, which promotes poverty. Fines and penalties accrue, and they go up as you cannot pay them, and interest is accrued. People lose their job and become unemployable. They can lose their ID or their driver's license. Once they get out, once they have to apply for background checks, they can lose their housing, they lose their reputation, they lose their business referrals and their network. They also lose credit, and they end up with no backup savings. They get behind in work the longer they're out of the system and unemployable, and they get behind in technology skills. Oftentimes, depending on the kind of an arrest, they will lose credentials, their degrees, or their certificates and have to make a career change. If they have a conviction history or a DUI history, it affects their ability to go to Canada. It affects their driving careers, and people can lose entire careers because of a DUI. And most people don't understand any of these losses. They don't understand that these are the things that happen just from an arrest, whether you have found to be guilty or not. Typically, children and family relationships are broken. Our network of social support is broken, and the individual and their family members become vulnerable to costly stress and accidents. The predictable result is that people enter relentless penalties to punishment to poverty. It's a human recycling system. And it's a system that works for the system, but it does not work for the people. Most people understand the jail industry as the idea that it's public safety because we operate a county jail, law enforcement puts bad guys in the jail, and that's what most of us believe, that that's what our tax dollars pay for, is for protection. But that's not necessarily the way it always works. When a person gets arrested, whether they are guilty or not, they end up paying for processing and court fees. Once they get inside the jail, they end up paying for jail vendors like telephone services, assessment fees. They may have had to pay for towing fees, etc. And by the time they leave the jail or leave the system, often the common cost is at least $10,000 in debt or costs that are accrued, guilty or not. Hidden behind the system, which is what most people don't want to talk about because it's not comfortable to talk about jails and prisons and criminals and incarceration and how the system is broken. The fact is, most of us pay our county executive, our sheriff, our officials to handle this business so that we don't have to think about it. But there are unrecognized costs to taxpayers that happen behind the actual cost of incarceration, such as pensions and benefits are paid out by taxpayers, fleet and facility costs are paid out, jail liabilities and medical costs are paid, lawsuits are paid out, and insurances for damages that may have been accrued because of the law and justice system or the jail system. Those debts are not typically covered when we talk about the cost of incarceration. We tend to isolate the jail costs, so we think the actual amount of money that taxpayers pay is less than it really is. There's a secondary set of costs that are absolutely not discussed in the cost of incarceration, and these are the immeasurable costs to society that happen when a person gets arrested. There is a lot of damage to the family unit. There's destruction of the workforce and the jobs, and the ability to go to work is often compromised. And as a result, there are hidden costs of depression, suicide, divorce, mental illness, various kinds of addiction loss, and trauma that happens to the family, that we end up needing nonprofits and other groups and medical care that are costs to society that are not measured when we just talk about whether we should build a jail or increase the size of the jail or talk about jail incarceration costs. There's a social justice study that I reference at the tail end of this slideshow that has done it. They've done a study and they've figured out that the cost of incarceration, as typically reported by the bureaucracies, nationwide is $80 billion. But when they did this study and they factored in the social costs to the actual cost of incarceration, the trauma and the misery that comes as a result of an arrest, the actual cost to taxpayers and the society and the families is closer to $1 trillion. That's a $920 billion shortfall when you start measuring the real cost of incarceration. There's a third and hidden factor that most people are completely unaware of, and people who get arrested don't like to talk about, because it is so excruciatingly painful once you get arrested for let's say an unfortunate circumstance, or you're in the wrong place at the wrong time, or you get in an accident, or you make a mistake and then you're arrested and you go into the system. The hidden cost to inmates and families is huge. The first thing typically that people are aware of is they have to buy a phone card or phone services so that they can call home to let people know that they're inside the jail, and that costs money to put money on the card. It costs money every minute that you call home. There's bail fees, towing fees, Department of Licensing fees. There's tests, insurances, and electronic home monitoring that may be accrued. Food, commissary, and medicine. These kinds of costs accrue to a person whether or not they are guilty, whether or not they've gone through the process of discovery about what actually happened. And a lot of these hidden costs to inmates and families are paid direct to service providers and contractors, many of whom are national service providers and contractors, and they make private profits on the services they provide, and they pay a percent back to the county. Well, let me explain what that might look like, because this is the big boondoggle that most people don't understand is really happening, and how the costs of incarceration are far worse than we think. An example of a commissary order in Whatcom County. Aramark Industries is an international corporation, and they do business and sell commissary goods and services to universities, to sports stadiums, to prisons, and jails across the nation. And they're the primary food provider and commissary provider in Whatcom County. I went and I clicked this to see if I could find the actual list of a big meal deal. They call it Make It a Feast. It's a meal deal for eye care that provides a feast to someone inside the jail. So if I was, say I had someone inside the jail and they wanted me to order them a Thanksgiving feast or some other kind of a feast, I would go into eye care gift bags and order a deal. If you look at this meal deal, it's $41.99, plus with shipping and handling, it's basically $50. Inside this, if you look through the list of what you're buying basically low-end fast food type snack products like snack crackers and Tito's spicy dill pickle, but you're also ordering 24 bags of top ramen. The person who first talked to me about this, it was a Thanksgiving feast that they were ordering, and they thought they were going to get a really nice dinner for the $50 that they were going to put on their card for their relative that was in the jail. And what they got was 24 bags of top ramen noodles, and they got 7 ounces of turkey, and they got a can of refried beans. And this is a direct copy of what it looks like if you are going to order a Thanksgiving feast for your family. It's $50. And most of us wouldn't want to order this and eat this ourselves, and yet this is what we're paying $50 for. What's worse is that once you enter the eye care marketing funnel, they will send you an order and offerings by email every few weeks to see if they can entice you to buy more candies and goodies and chips and stuff like this for your loved one who is inside the system. And at $50, this seems pretty amazing when the food is right across the hall or in the next building and you're paying $10 shipping and handling for it. But this is one of the ways that the commissary people make huge profits on a captive audience who's incarcerated and on their families. That kind of profiteering and privateering and marketeering becomes a cash-generating industry. When we privatized prisons a few decades ago, what it did is it opened the door for contractor organizations to start becoming government contractors. So it made way for large government expansions of jails and prisons, where the jail and prison vendors write contracts with the county and the municipal corporations or the state and federal corporations to be able to do business. The profiteers and the private corporations keep their services and their fees separate, and they pay a percent back to the county corporation. But what happens is that we end up with social service organizations that pick up the fallout for the damage that is caused within a jail system when the goal is to build a jail, grow the jail industries. It's a contrarian industry. Up at the top of this chart, we talk about a lot of the private companies that do business and they charge direct costs to the families. And I've listed some of these already, but there's booking and penalties and assessments. There's the addiction industries, court fines, legal and financial obligations, probation costs, urinalysis tests, DNA tests, travel and phone and medical costs, excess medical above and beyond just immediate medical needs, attorney's fees, appeals fees, license fees. All of these things can accrue to a person whether or not they have been found guilty. And one of the things that we've learned is that roughly 70% of the people who end up in a jail system are there and they have not yet been found guilty, and a large percentage of these people are nonviolent people who are awaiting their pre-trial, they're awaiting action by the court system. On top of these direct costs to family type companies that are preying upon a captive audience and their families, there is the financial mega business money game that is played by investors and people who are the heavy hitters in the jail industry, the prison industrial complex, or what's called the jail industrial complex. These are large national or multinational even corporations who run finance companies, credit card companies, the bonding and securities companies, the data mining and insurance industries, and the banking industries that are making money on the investment, the real estate investment of building jails, prisons, detention centers. There's insourcing that's done inside these prisons and inside the state and federal prisons. And some of the institutions like colleges, universities, nonprofits are actually obligated to have to buy goods that are produced by the jail industry. So there's an entire faux economy that develops in the background of the jail industrial complex that most of us have no idea about, and it never runs through the county coffers, so there's nowhere to measure it, and it hasn't been studied very strongly across the nation yet. So in the lower left-hand corner of this chart, I talk about the profiteering. What happens is that there's a lot of volume that accelerates based upon the churn of people through the system. Profit margins increase with no boundaries and no one to check why you're paying $50 for 25 bags of top ramen. There's controlled conditions and a captive audience that you can market to that cannot get away from you. So it promotes businesses to be less responsible because they can buy in high volumes, they can mark it up, and no one's checking on them. There's a whole level of stock trading and options trading that can happen on these companies that are jail and prison industry service providers. And the biggest problem is that recidivism here is pretty predictable, because you know that once people fail into the system, they stay in the system. One person who fails into the jail industry, if they end up in the prison system, they become a $55,000 a year cash generating asset to the state corporation. What I mean by that is that they're going to consume over $55,000 worth of taxpayer dollars in order to house and operate the jail system for one person who's an inmate, and that's not including the money that are direct costs to families, which is this privateering industry game, and it doesn't include any of the money that is invested or made in the insourcing and the private building contractors. And that whole other mega business money game isn't even considered. So if we have an individual, they come in and they were not guilty of a crime, but because of the system, they end up failing into the system, 10 years inside a state prison, they're worth $500,000 to the cash generating industry. And that's a negative investment. It's a negative failure system that most taxpayers would not be happy to know is really operating when we're talking about the jail industrial complex. The community is damaged by escalating hard costs when we start to build jails, because if you build it, they will fill it. If there is a need for revenue to be generated, we will figure out a way to generate revenue. One of the ways in Whatcom County is they want to pass a sales tax to increase revenue to the government corporations for unrestrained expansion. That's the way I see it. Basically, if we pass a 0.2% sales tax this year to build a jail, it's really a blank check that increases costs everywhere and raises taxes for local businesses. It removes discretionary spending from family budgets, and it's a discriminatory tax that impacts people, reduces margins on all fronts. If we were to pass that 0.2% sales tax, which I do not recommend, is that the taxpayers end up with a forever debt. It is estimated that to build a bigger jail, it would be $128 million estimated. It's commonly understood that when you start with that kind of an estimation, that the cost will mushroom to over $300 million. And that's just for the 30-year capital bond to start construction, and that doesn't that doesn't account for the operating costs that will put our youth and our children forever into tax bondage to pay the hard costs of running an alligator of a facility. Right now, there is no valid needs assessment that really shows that there is a proven demand for this high debt, expensive project, and that has adequately examined the alternatives to building that jail or other solutions that would make it obsolete to have to build a larger jail system. Nationally, we've learned that bureaucracy expands, laws expand, law enforcement expands. The more you invest in prisons, the more restraint you get. On top of that, locally, if we invest that kind of money in that kind of a prison industrial complex, the jobs change in the community. They change from supporting independent businesses to promoting a jail-based economy. This harms our local workforce as people become cash-generating assets to the prison industry, and in effect, they get hooked into an addiction system that keeps them cycling through the system. So families are damaged and displaced, the social structure is compromised, and eventually our children grow up to become inmates or employees of jail industries. We believe it is better to invest in people's success, not in their failure. Our recommendation is fix the current jail. This saves hundreds of millions in capital debt and operating overhead. Secondly, do diversion, pre-arrest diversion. Use the work release for intervention recovery, and reentry after arrest as well. Do pre-arrest prevention work, like help our people with mental health, trauma recovery, and healing programs. Do restorative housing, relationship skills building training programs, and job renewal programs. Develop jobs that at a restorative justice and healing center for revitalizing our workforce. These are actions that we can take to help build jobs before jails, to strengthen our workforce, to educate people before we incarcerate. This is good for society, and it's good for our future. My name is Joy Gilfilen, and I'm president of the Restorative Community Coalition. Our goal has been to understand addictive economic dynamics locally so that we could replace mass incarceration with mass empowerment of people. People who become productive members of society become healthy taxpayers. They become good workers. When we heal society, the community benefits all ways. At our website, which is restorativecommunity.com, you can download a couple of reports that we've produced, and you can also go and check out these facts, statistics, and references to find out more about the growth of the jail industry and why it is smarter to invest in alternatives. You can get a 20 to 75, even as high as a $599 cost-benefit ratio when investing in solutions rather than more jails. In Whatcom County, there's no better time to stop patterns that don't work than before we pass a blank check tax. Let's invest in people, not failure, and let's do restorative economic solutions. Thank you.